everyone. Hope you enjoyed the conference so far. So many interesting sessions, but I have a feeling this one will be one of the best panel. I'm Maria Accente. I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge in UK, among many others, and I'm delighted today to be the host of a stellar panel. And I've introduced the panelists one by one, but then we'll go straight into the subject. First, we have Betsy Greytalk. She's a VP in Ethics and Policy at IBM. Then we have Dr. Latifa Al-Abdul Karim, a member of Ashura Council and advisor in AI and Law. Then we have Dr. Maria Grazia Scucciarini, Director and Chief of Executive Office at UNESCO. Then we have Mark Rothenberg, President and Founder, Center for AI and Digital Policy. And last but not least, we had Nicholas Mailey, President and Co-Founder of the Future Society. Welcome, guys. Today we're going to talk about our favorite subject, ethics, policy, and regulation. What's the state of the art at the moment? What should we expect to see more in the future? Can I go first to you, Betsy? How is the world of ethics and policy seen through the eyes of IBM?
First, thank you for having me here today. And that's quite a complex question at this point in time. IBM has been, our company has been founded on values, so we have over 100 years of values-based operations. But in 2015, we appointed our first AI global ethics leader, Francesca Rossi, who will be a speaker here later in the summit. And since that time, IBM has been working to take policy principles and turn it into policy. And so since that time, we have developed an AI ethics review board. It is co-chaired by Francesca Rossi and also our chief privacy officer. And our chief privacy officer has a corporate directive in which she is mandated for the governance of our AI ethics policies. So it has become a corporate policy within us. And then my organization supports all of the work that surrounds having an AI ethics board and all of the different work streams that come out of the work of that. So we are not only looking at AI and the ethical issues around that, but we're looking at neurotechnology, we're looking at quantum, constantly looking at where the emerging technologies and the emerging issues are, and then following where potential regulations are coming and making sure that these are a cohesive group that can work together.
Fantastic. It's worth saying that IBM is a trailblazer when it comes to implementing ethics and policy. And actually, there is a use case, a case study produced by World Economic Forum on the story of implementing responsible technology in IBM. Thank you very much. Next to you, Latifa. How is the world of AI ethics and policy seen through your eyes?
Thanks for you, Maria, and thanks for Betsy for showing a clear example of how to combine between innovation and policies, which has been always an issue, and where people always thought that innovation would be hindered if we are going to apply the political and ethical principles of AI. So I would like just to add notes here that, in short, ethical principles, policies, and regulations of AI shouldn't slow down the innovation side of AI system. In fact, it's supposed to be a core factor for the success and sustainability of any AI system. If we know how to be capable to merge and find a synergy between those two groups, the innovation team and the policies team. So I think we need to go through different approaches, especially after the short announcement of Dr. Majid Tuwaijri about the UNESCO's recommendation on the AI ethics, or on the ethics of AI. So what shall we do now to make sure that all the innovation hubs, for example, have this kind of policy labs? We can't play the innocent role anyways now. We have to raise the awareness and trainings for tech policies and try to bring the policy engineers together with AI engineers, so we can find this mix between the two in order to know how to implement those ethical assessments that we need to work on in the next step now for an implementation of the recommendation. In addition, I want to also add a note on about fostering the innovation of technical solutions on the ethical principles. So we need to focus on finding technical solutions on fairness, on bias, on the explainability for different context and domain-based use cases. And this is where throughout my experience in Europe and UK, I can find many companies who are working in this field, and maybe it's time to encourage local companies to work on the technical solutions on ethical principles to make sure that the people who are working in AI, and the developers or AI actors, engineers who are working on developing AI systems can find a way to apply those principles by values without having struggles at the end of the implementation of the system.
I think it's fair to say that we come to a point where we need to move from principle into practice. And this is where I'm going to go to Maria Grazia to share us a little bit about their experience at UNESCO, putting together a set of ethical principles for AI that are so not only fundamental for the world of AI, but their impact will be felt well beyond the world of AI. Maria Grazia.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Maria. I couldn't agree more with Latifa. And it is true that we are, I think, at a turning point where we have to move from principles to practice. And actually, today's event, as well as the announcement that was just made, make it really hopeful for the future, that they are really starting to walk the talk. I'm sure everybody here knows that the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, which is actually this very baby, is not the first instrument that has come in the world, but is actually in line with all the efforts that have been done before. The OECD principles, the G20 principles. But I think what it adds to that is the 193 countries that are member states to the UNESCO that has actually adopted the normative instrument. So we're really talking about a global instrument. And also the fact that it is based really on human rights. So each and every part of the recommendation is human rights based. The other thing that I think the recommendation does, and this is, I think, important for the implementation, is to be ethical by design. You were saying it. We need to design the algorithms in a way that they are not discriminating, that they are inclusive, that they rely on data that are representatives, for instance, that they don't violate privacy. So why we believe this is important here? Because at the end of the day, the AI, different types of AI technologies are way too pervasive. They influence our daily lives, our works, our future as well. And this time, compared to other times, because of the big impact, this being a general purpose technology, if we do something in the wrong way, and we then need to collect the pieces might be way too small to be put together. And that's why we think it's important to go to ethics by design and do everything in an ethical manner, because ethics shouldn't be an ex post thought after AI is developed and implemented. And I'll stop it here for the moment.
And I think having this consistency globally is really important. I'll turn to you, Mark, how important it is to have a set of global standards, but frameworks that will allow us to tap into the expertise, but also a set of best practices that have been developed in different parts of the world.
I think that's a great point, Marissa. We live in a global environment, a networked environment. Information moves rapidly, innovation moves rapidly, but we also need in place the basic standards and safeguards that promote trust and confidence in new services. We want the public to welcome innovation, to not be scared, but this requires ensuring the public that the necessary steps have been taken. And I want to, congratulate UNESCO. I think the adoption of the recommendation on AI ethics is a great step forward. Also congratulate KSA. I think this announcement today on the AI ethics project, which takes the next step with principles, which helps us understand the critical importance of implementation so that we actually see that there's an assessment to determine if we're following those standards. I think the tough problem ahead, which maybe we'll have a chance to talk about, is where do we establish the red lines and the prohibitions? When do we say about a particular system, maybe this one doesn't go forward?
I think that's a very important point. Why don't we discuss it now? Where are the red tapes? Where we should never draw the line when
Well,
AI?
you know, if we look at the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics, it covers many themes, but it also speaks in particular to two AI applications that are very controversial. And one AI application that is controversial is mass surveillance, to use a camera system across the city to monitor and track people. There's been a lot of protest about this, and countries have begun to look at that practice and say, is this really the society that we want to build with our technology? Another practice that the UNESCO recommendation addresses is social scoring. Do we want governments to assign numbers to individuals with a practical consequence that they may not get a job or education or be able to travel? So those are two very interesting examples, and they're actually taken directly from the UNESCO recommendation.
So it's really important to keep that balance in between benefits and risk at all time when we talk about AI, which is, in fact, a fundamental change in how we think of policy and strategy altogether. Going to you, Nico, how is the world of accountability and responsibility in the world of AI seen through the eyes of the future society?
Well, if I take a step back, I think that the first part of the panel is really projecting the fact that it's now time to move from principles to practice. It's how we're going to do that. So if I were to put a few elements on the table in terms of what's the right feedback loop between principles and practice, I'd say that we should never forget, because here we're talking at, and that's fine, at 30,000 feet. We're very far away from the ground where the rubber meets the road. We really want to design this feedback loop in a way that it impacts the behaviors of investors, of developers, and of deployers of AI systems. If investors do not bank upon the need for downstream developments and deployments to behave ethically, to deal with algorithmic bias, this will not happen. We have seen the limits of their commitments when they're not backed by legislation. It's called, in the domain of green finance, greenwashing. We do not want a situation leading to ethics washing. As an example, we always need to keep in eyesight that we want to impact through the ethics impact assessment that UNESCO is developing, the readiness assessment methodology. We want to impact behaviors. Now, this will be done through, hopefully, smart cocktails of, yes, hard regulation, because markets have to be driven towards certain incentives. But not only that, smart cocktails of hard, but also self and soft regulatory mechanisms through compliance. And what lies upon us right now is to create the right, in a way, feedback loop that is culturally adaptable, but also upholds the universal rights, and put at the center of this effort a key element that is overly underinvested, which is capacity building. We can codify whatever we want, in whatever form we want. If we do not put capacity and the building of capacity at the center of the effort, these commitments will become moot. And as a result, the downstream behaviors we are trying to affect, investors, developers, deployers, will not get affected.
It's an interesting thread that I'm picking up from all of you, how profoundly transformative AI is, much more than we originally thought. It's not only that we need to prepare our organization, go from a linear thinking into a more dynamic stochastic thinking, we also need to tap into the expertise with a wide variety of stakeholders. And my next questions to you all is, who needs to be at the table of decision around the ethics of AI, implementation of ethics of AI? There are so many thorny ethical dilemmas that need to be addressed. And also, who needs to be at the table when public policy is being drafted and implemented at the level of individual countries? Latifa.
Thanks so much for the question. I couldn't agree more with Nicola. For the stakeholders, there are still, generally speaking, there are still difficulties in forming those stakeholders from multidisciplines. I thought that it's from my experience only, but Nicola told me no, it's a worldwide issue here. So I'm thinking like, why don't we have like a guideline or assessment for classifying those stakeholders, their roles, their involvement type within the AI system life cycle, and at the same time make sure or make sure that to align those classification to context-based use cases. Back to your question, you asked me about who are those stakeholders. Definitely we are thinking about the technical and non-technical team. The technical will be the AI actors, designers, engineers, developers, testers, and so on. From the non-technical side, which is the most important and the most difficult to decide and determine, is I'm thinking about the people who will determine the impact of such AI solution on the economy or on the business value. So that we need to have the business owners, the marketing team, the economic people, and maybe the investors, like what Nicola has just mentioned. Or the people from the humanitarian side, so people who could study the behavior of the clients and understand the impact of such system on the behavior of, for example, the clients in certain AI solution. Also, of course, the compliance and audit, legal team, and others. I want to highlight a pinpoint on the investors. Locally, we have a good number of VCs, angel investors, and funds who are investing heavily and actively in AI and data companies. So in addition to the business assessment that they are doing, I highly recommend them to understand and explore more questions related to the ethical assessment and the risk plan of those companies in order to avoid, or I wouldn't say avoid, but at least limit the drawbacks of their investments from those companies at later stage. So that's maybe a recommendation, I would say, for investors and companies as well, is to go through AI toolkit maybe for the C-suite. When I think, Maria, you were
the
there.
Economic Forum,
Yeah,
yes,
for
we both did.
exactly, from the World Economic Forum. That will be very helpful for even giant companies to know about their even marketing team, or how can they show their effort on the ethical side and trustworthy solutions within their marketing team.
Such a great point Latifa is making, building on what Nico said earlier about the need to go with the conversation from bigger organizations into SMEs, smaller and medium enterprise, because that's where a lot of creativity of AI happens. But when in IBM now, almost like Tifa created a blueprint of who needs to be at the table, who's at your table at IBM?
So I tend to look at stakeholders slightly differently than what's been described here, because I'm looking at a more practical solution and then building the policy given the reality of what we're working in. So if I look at it at a timeline and you have a good idea and you want to design a solution, then you may be starting with designers, developers, engineers, the technology side, and those are your foundational stakeholders. Then you also move into, and they may be developing technology that is used to build AI systems, or they may be building AI systems. Those are not quite the same. So your definition of stakeholders may grow as you explore different definitions of what AI actually is. Then you'll have the companies that are going to actually develop the systems and deploy them, put them into use. And in my mind, some people would say that's the end user. That is who's turning on the switch and the AI is working. But there's actually more stakeholders at the end, which is the person who is actually impacted by the system. And so that is the person who is applying for a loan or applying for a job or engaging with the AI in some other factor. And they may not have any control as to what has happened what went into the system before that. And of course, you have the data owners and all the background. And you do need this continuous loop of conversation and input coming from starting with the end users. I think you have to start with the end user and what is the impact going to be on them. And you, of course, have to look at it in a broad economy scale. It's not just this one person. It may be their entire family. It may be their entire community. It may be a segment of the population. So you have to start with that perspective. That informs going back around to the designers and the developers, and then continuously feeding that through the loop. And then once the AI system is actually operating, you can't just say, I'm done, and it's operating. It requires continuous monitoring and making sure that you've got the accuracy built in there. So stakeholders quickly becomes a very complex question, bringing many people to the table. And the way that we address it is to, one, to have conversations with these people, but then also bring in the other experts and that have different viewpoints. And as we heard in some of the talks this morning, overlaying all of that is a requirement for diversity. And the important part of diversity and inclusion in that theme is, somebody said, you have to have people that look differently. It's not about looks, it's about cultures, and it's about thoughts and beliefs. So you have to have that set of diversity, and then the really key part is the inclusion. Okay, I can hear what you said it, it hit my ears, but I really need to hear it, I need to understand it, and I need to incorporate it again into this continuous feedback loop that you've talked about.
And be able to account for that perspective in the decision making. I was thinking 193 countries, UNESCO, right? So you must have seen the widest variety of stakeholders coming together for these principles. What have you learned? What was this like one key takeaway from interacting with hundreds, if not thousands, of experts in this process, Maria Grazia?
Well, we learned a lot. And actually, I couldn't agree more with Betsy that said, you have to be inclusive by design. Now, in the case of UNESCO, I wasn't there yet by the time the discussion started, but joined by the time there were the final agreement on the text. And I can tell you that we had to use AI in order to process all the comments, for instance, that we were receiving from all the participants and the different consultations that we held. But, we learned really, and this has always been in UNESCO's principle that is bring everybody on board. But that process, the inclusivity of it, led to this adoption of the recommendation by acclamation, which means really that we need to bring together policymakers. Without them, there is no regulation. So, it really becomes difficult to go from principle to facts. You need to bring also the companies, the private sector, the big and the small. And also, in that case, we have to be careful because very often around the table, we always see the same faces. Whereas you also have been inclusive in that sense means also bringing, and you mentioned it, also the small companies and learn from them and what are their needs. We need to have academics. I mean, very often we complain about the fact that algorithms are not ethically compliant. But do we ask ourselves, in how many universities these days we have programs where, say, programmers learn what it means or are sensibilized towards ethical challenges when programming? Normally, programmers care about efficiency, effectiveness, speed of computation, energy use. But are they faced with ethical questions? Well, not really often. So there is an awareness raising and also competency enhancing kind of challenge here. And last but not least, individuals and civil society. We hope this time we will bring everybody together so that, for instance, civil society doesn't come afterwards complaining about what they would like to see in the implementation, but they didn't see. I was discussing this with Nicolas before, and the idea is really to have this ethical by design, and also to learn from each other. You said before that it's very important to see how it evolves and how it develops. And we think that regional, for instance, steering committees that we are trying to support the creation of might be one of the best way forward, because then you learn from each other. You have communalities that you can rely upon, and you can build synergies. And so this helps also in moving from principle to facts.
So at the core of building responsible and ethical AI, and to that matter, any type of responsible technology lies a group of like-minded people and not like-minded people, because we need diversity. But so far we've heard a variety of stakeholders that need to be at the table, Mark. But what about politicians? What do they see? How do they see the world of AI? How is Washington? What's Washington saying about the AI those days?
Well, that's a very good question and may require a separate conference. But certainly it's important for those who are policy makers to hear from these different constituencies. And I will say, because we work with a lot of policymakers, the business groups are very good at attending and making known their interests. It's oftentimes more difficult for the civil society organizations to be able to participate in the meetings. And I actually wanted to commend UNESCO, because I spent a couple of years working on the recommendations. It was a very transparent process. It was a very inclusive process, but it also required an affirmative commitment to say, not just in theory, we would like civil society's participation, we need to help make that possible. And this is reflected then in the policy outcomes, because when the decision makers and the politicians get a full range of views, I think what they end up with is a policy that's more legitimate, more well understood, and more easily adopted than a policy that's made in secret, let's say. So in that respect, a process right now under the auspices of the Council of Europe to develop a convention on AI, I think has good prospects. And the Council of Europe, like UNESCO, has created an open and inclusive process. They will bring their recommendations back to national governments, and then the national governments, I think, will be able to move forward that initiative as well.
From you describe, this new approach to AI policy and regulation will benefit not just the AI industries in different parts of the world, but probably will benefit society at large, because it's a new mindset of public policy altogether. And I want to go next to you, Nico, and from your experience in balancing best practice at global level and implement them locally, which stakeholders have been in this conversation, in translating what's global into meaningful action in a specific context?
So up to now, we've been talking about this feedback loop between principles to practice. I wouldn't disagree with anything which has been said about stakeholders. I'm just going to spice it up a little bit, the conversation. I think that AI does not fall from the sky. It does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges from the ground of a digital political economy. And so one concept I want to put on the table in terms of framing the level of stakeholder conversations we require is called the value chain. As a domain moves from innovation to industrial massive use, it turns into a value chain. And so we absolutely need to be careful in building the right sharing of the value across the value chain. And the value chain indeed includes consumers at the very bottom and producers, but an entire set and ecosystems of actors, including SMEs. And I say that and I insist on that because in the emerging AI industrial value chain that we're witnessing right now, a story of concentration of power at the top and at the center is the norm. This is simply not tenable. We will not get the kind of balance between universally and culturally diverse acceptable if we don't deal from a stakeholder engagement through that. And the beauty of the value chain concept is that it's well mapped, well understood economically. And just to give you a practical example, if the dominating AI solution baseline right now is transformer-based large language models, which are developed only by big corporations, we need to be very careful in these cocktails of soft and hard regulatory mechanisms that we split the liability, the responsibility across the value chain. In other words, it's dangerous to have the small enterprise, which is close to the customer, bear the responsibility of an algorithmic bias if the large model is developed somewhere else by a big company. We need to share those risks. It's not going to be easy, but it's extremely important. So stakeholder engagement has to be baked into the sharing of the value across the value chain, industrial value chain.
Being able to reassess the boundaries of responsibility. And I think Brad Smith from Microsoft had talked about extended responsibility, which is a fantastic term applicable, especially large organizations operating globally. They need to reassess the role they play in society, and especially developing technology as disruptive and transformative as an AI. Unfortunately, we only have 1.5 minutes, but I want to extend a little bit my time, so apologies, organize it in advance, to get one final remark, very short and snip. Where do we go from here? Maria Grazia.
We go to implementing the tools that Nicolas was talking about, the readiness assessment. We need to understand where countries are, what they need to do. We are working on the ethical impact assessment that will help monitoring how they evolve. And we're also going into having Experts Without Borders, helping governments putting in place the right regulations as a start.
Fantastic. Mark?
We need to maintain our focus on human-centric and trustworthy AI. That is the core foundation. I think that's the basis for policy, and it will be the basis for public understanding as we rapidly deploy these new services.
I'll say here, here. Nico?
We enter in earnest the institutional innovation requirement needed to deliver regulatory sandboxing programs, certification schemes, independent auditing schemes, metrological schemes, benchmarking schemes. We institutionally innovate in earnest.
Fantastic. Betsy?
Yeah, I place the focus on kind of building on what Mark said, which is that AI should be augmenting humans and not replacing them, so focus on augmentation. And then I'll touch on a point that came up earlier this morning. Education is so important. Educating, we are starting it in middle school, which is age 11. So children through adult learners, all of your developers, all of the stakeholders we mentioned, all need education on this topic.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, on the top of all these comments, I think we need to focus on, after all these procedures, on implementing the AI Observatory platform to know where exactly, how to oversight and how to ensure robustness and adherence to the ethical guidelines as part of the ethical impact assessment.
Fantastic. Like always, time is short, so short when you're having fun. Thank you so very much, guys. A big round of applause to my panelists. And hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you.